And I think there are two things that are important for the discussion here today. The global risk report that usually before such a forum is published and that points out that there are a number of challenges in the world out there, and indeed very great challenges if we just look at climate change and natural disasters, but also cyber attacks and the challenges and terror attacks that entails. So at the same time, there are a number of disturbances, a certain amount of disquiet in the international system as a whole. So apart from the usual challenges, this leads to also a lowering of predictions of growth by the International Monetary Fund, which means that on the whole, the picture is rather gloomy, and maybe a forum such as this one lends itself ideally to bring a bit more security into the system rather than worrying people even more, because I think there are a lot of people who are more than willing to strengthen the international order. If we look at the international order today, at the architecture at the beginning of the 21st century, this global architecture is still very much influenced by the results of actions taken after the Second World War. We have the United Nations, we have formats that developed later on, such as G7, G20, at the level of heads of state and government, as a reaction to one of the most important crises that in a way was also very much influenced by the digital age, namely the big financial crisis more than 10 years ago. And if we're honest, we are still feeling the repercussions of that, because politicians have lost a lot of their credit in the eyes of the world, but also the financial and the banking sector has lost a lot of its credibility. We have put up a banking union, we have put up regulations to ward this off, but if you ask the people in our countries, the belief in a stable international financial system has indeed been damaged quite significantly, and we have to do everything in order to avoid a repetition of that. If we look at the big companies, if we look at the balance sheets of big corporations and of banks, we know that there is still an impact out there, and that we also have less of a freedom of maneuver to tackle upcoming crises. So we have to, if you like, try and retrench. There are then bigger international organizations that came into being later, such as the World Trade Organization, later than in the immediate post-war period, that is. And we have seen a development that has shown that this global architecture, the international organizations such as ILO, the World Bank, IMF, also OECD, that all of these organizations have contributed to actually bringing the world into a better place. Let us remind all of us, in 1971, the world had 3.8 million people, and 60% of them lived in extreme poverty. Today, we have 7.6 billion people, and only 10% live in extreme poverty. So that's 700 to 800 million. Yes, that's true. But if we look at absolute numbers, it is less. And also, as regards the percentage, it's less. And one of the highlights of international decisions we have taken is that the SDGs for 2030 have been adopted, that the global community was very much throwing its whole weight behind this. We want, by 2030, to overcome extreme poverty, and I'm confident we will be able to do that. There are also other areas where there's a light at the end of the tunnel. If we look at the Compact for Refugees, the Compact of Migration that was adopted by the United Nations, and there was also quite a large majority. But these two examples also come into play when we talk about the international order being under pressure. What are the root causes of that? If we look at the history of mankind, basic decisions for the order that we have today, well, they were taken about 74 years ago. That that, if you like, is the age that the average person lives. So after the horrors of the Second World War, the people who were then in power, the people who were in responsibility, had certain insights, and they knew what they were doing. So we shouldn't these days cast their decisions aside and the system that they set up and treat it lightly, because they did so against the wealth of experience. We've also seen that these international organizations, after all, are very slow in reforming. If I think of the number of years we needed to push through the reform of the quota in WTO or the capital increase for the World Bank, this was urgently necessary because for many, many years already emerging economies such as China and India influenced our global economy much more than we thought. And if a system doesn't react to it quickly enough, then the result will inevitably be that others, well, will perhaps establish new institutions throwing their weight around. And that has happened. Apart from the established G20 format, apart from the World Bank, we now have an Asian Investment Bank, for example. Apart from the G20, we have a Shanghai Organization for Economic Cooperation, where you have China, Russia, and other countries. China is seeking a 16+1 format in order to work together with parts of the European Union. That actually ought to alarm us in the sense that it's a wake-up call. I, who come from the part of the world that is very much influenced by Western values, I think we ought to say we are ready to look at established institutions, but reform them in such a way that the balance of power is actually realistically reflected in the way that they are built up. We also know that the question, how do we move forward, is something that splits the world, it divides the world. And I think we ought to call a spade a spade. Let us not evade the issue. We have certain institutions that set global guidelines, that set global guardrails. And then we have to accept realities and reform that. But there is a new approach that we see in the world today, an approach that harbors great doubts as to the validity of the international system. They say, shouldn't we look after our own? Shouldn't we look after our own interests first? And then, out of that, develop an order that is good for all. I have my grave doubts that this is the right way to go about it. I think our national interests, well, we should understand them in such a way that we always remember that others also have their own vested interests, factor them in, and then shape a win-win situation that will guide us in international politics. I see myself in a tradition, if you like, of someone who I greatly revere, Max Weber, the great sociologist, who exactly 100 years talked about the ethics that ought to guide politicians, those who have taken up politics as a profession, and who said compromise is a result of responsible actions by politicians. And when people say these days, oh, compromise is something that one shouldn't accept, it's bad, it's negative, I must say, very clearly and unequivocally, a global architecture will only work if we, all of us, are ready and willing for compromise. Now, if we look at the present architecture of global institutions, it is difficult to reform them. It is difficult to bring them forward. But you here with the World Economic Forum are asking a question that goes even further. Now we have a disruptive revolution. Now we have a digital world, 4.0. What does this mean for us? And I'm standing here before you as someone who wishes to strengthen multilateralism, who thinks that multilateral institutions are absolutely indispensable if we want to live well in the world of tomorrow. So, where can we put down new markers? A little tongue-in-cheek, I could say, but I'm serious still. We are actually able to do certain things on the 16th of November. I don't know whether this has come to your attention, but in November, the annual conference on measures and measurements has taken place, and the old ampere was cast aside on weights and measures. measurements. And in this world of weights and measurements, this was a true revolution. The international community agreed to adopt this, and as of March 2019, we will all have agreed measurements, and the old kilo from 1898 will not, 1889 will not shrink anymore, but it will be, if you like, a clearly defined kilo that we all share. So there is room for reform, and we ought to adopt this. We ought to adopt these new ideas for this new age. The great challenges are clear to all of us. How do we deal with data? How do we analyze and evaluate data? What about ownership of data? All of that is something that we are grappling with. Then, as a consequence of big data, this big data world we live in, we have a huge leap forward in artificial intelligence. And here it will be very important to put down ethical guidelines. And I would also like to mention bioethics, genetics. We do not, as yet, have agreed legal instruments that are applicable globally. And we need to find answers to that. So, as yet, I don't see a global architecture that deals with all of these different issues. But I don't think it would be, one can say that each and every big power will find different answers to that. If we look at the two different poles that we have these days as regards how to deal with data, we have on the one hand the United States. There, the data very much are owned by private players, by private stakeholders, and it's difficult to set down guidelines where the limits to this private ownership are. And I would say that the rules that we had in our former world are not rules that we can completely cast aside when we talk about rules for the digital world. Then, on the other hand, we have China, where the state has a lot of access to data, even personal data. So, in a way, you have here two different extremes that I feel are not in line with the ideas that I would have and that Germany would have, and in line with social market economy, as we know it, where we say the rights of the individual need to be protected. I think the European Union, even though it has its flaws, obviously, with adopting the General Data Protection Regulation, has given itself a good guideline as to how to deal with private data. Sometimes it's difficult, I know, but I think for the people, when industrial revolution started and when people moved from the rural areas into town, it was certainly also difficult for them to, well, if you like, have a key ring with different keys to get into their different homes. These are, after all, developments that we have to accept and changes that we have to accept. We have to protect our individual rights. Then we have the great question on tax, on fairness in taxation. I must say that I look with great interest at what the OECD is currently doing on this, and I think if we actually use a combination of a minimum taxation and what the finance ministers have drawn up with BEPS, that if we combine that, we come to more clarity in our taxation. We shouldn't leave this at all to take its natural course. We have to put down guidelines. When we had difficulties in the NSA, you will remember, as of 2013, 2014, we have tried in the General Assembly of the United Nations and also in the Human Rights Council to table certain resolutions that deal with how to deal with digital data and personal data in the digital age. There was a good cooperation with Mexico, with Austria, and with others, and we're trying to define ever more clearly how we can get forward in this, but it is a rather slow-moving and arduous process. I am delighted to know that President Shinzo Abe said that the presidency of the G20 of Japan is one that he wishes to use in order to tackle the question how we deal with data, with personal data. Also, I think the G20 is the ideal format to come to a comprehensive agreement and coordination among the industrialized nations to tackle this. If we, as Germans, want to participate in building up such a global architecture, giving it its shape, the precondition is obviously that we are well considered to be an important and economically strong player who is able to actually see to it that these ethical guidelines carry the day. That too is one of the truths. You can only leave an international footprint if you are economically strong, if you are on par with the others, if you cannot only analyze problems and give others sort of moral guidance, but if you speak out of your own experience. Let me come back to my own country, to Germany. We still have a strong economy, but very strong due to the industrial age. We still have a lot of our value added in the manufacturing sector, also in, for example, the automotive industry. And if we look at the revolutionary changes we've seen in the automotive industry, at large, we also know that there are certain risks looming on the horizon. Risks, they may well do damage to our employment situation, also risks that data management entails. Who owns those data? If they always are owned by platforms, our opportunities are less good than if they are owned by the car makers. But there's also a fact that neither in Germany nor in Europe are we able to actually manufacture battery cells. That is certainly something that will mean that we lag behind. So I am very much for taking the necessary decisions in industrial policy. We've already done that in the chip production. We ought to use this potential that Europe offers us to sort of again, close this gap in industrial manufacturing together. I don't think that we can leave in electromobility, for example, the advantages and advances that have been made to others. Germany has three big challenges ahead that have a lot to do with our future, and that I would like to mention here. First, the energy transition, affordable energy, but also sustainable energy, energy that we can produce by living up to our climate targets, is something that we need to provide. I am deeply convinced, and it's becoming apparent year by year, that climate change is a huge challenge for all of us on this planet. And that means that industrialized countries have a responsibility, not because of CO2 emissions that we have with our 80 million people will change the overall picture, but we as industrialized country have already emitted CO2 to a very large extent, and against that background we have developed technologies that can help others. And even though that may have an impact on our energy prices, renewables are now the area which are leading in our energy mix, if we look at the percentage. Until by 2020, we will have left nuclear energy, and then we have the very difficult problem that the only energy source that can actually generate energy all the time is brown coal and hard coal. Brown coal is not being subsidized, so it's a fairly cheap source of energy, but it obviously emits a lot of CO2. We have now set up a commission that is in the final stages of its work. It is working on the decommissioning of coal-fired power plants, but without being able to assure a base load in our energy generation, we will not be able to survive. So we will need it for a certain period of time. And this conflict that you hear raging on our energy supply is also a bit exaggerated. We will continue to receive Russian gas. We will also receive liquefied gas from other sources. We're building up the infrastructure on LNG in all directions. We will also get supplies from the United States eventually, but If we leave coal, if we leave nuclear, then we will need more natural gas, and energy, after all, needs to be affordable. That brings me to a point which I wish to mention very honestly. In our coalition agreement, we've put this down. Our constructions, all of the building plans we have are working far too slowly. We are now obviously in need of a totally different power grid. All of the power lines have to be put underground, and the construction is far too slow. I see our Minister for Energy is present here. We have to do this, obviously, without faster, obviously without completely neglecting planning structures and planning regulations. Now, on digital too, we have to set up the necessary infrastructure. But, and this is what I'm most concerned about, and we will have to use the European level to tackle this, is that in platform economy, we are far behind other parts of the world. Countries that have a somewhat saturated and well-working administration perhaps don't feel the need to, well, innovate as emerging economies do that. And what the state is doing with its citizens is not as digitalized as it should be. So we plan to see to it that all of the services we provide to our citizens are at the very latest by 2025 really digitalized. But on the European level, we are unfortunately not really front runners, so we are unfortunately lag behind. And on digital transformation, I think, is working quite well, at least in Germany, among big companies. It's getting better with the SMEs. B2B is working quite well, but business to customer, that is where we clearly have a lot to do, and we're in competition between those who are working in the platform economies and those who are offering services to the customers. I think that, at least for Germany, that is a battle that is not yet won. I think we need to be faster. Then the demographic change in Germany. Here, freedom of movement within the European Union is a big help, but after decades of discussion in Germany, we have now decided to adopt an immigration legislation for skilled labor. That means that we need to obviously manage migration better, but here too, I think over the past few years, we have made great strides. And ladies and gentlemen, we have seen, and that is something that I ought to add as a fourth point, we have seen that we can only make progress if we abandon this way of thinking that we can go it alone. The war in Syria, terrorism in Iraq. We have seen how globalization and its repercussions will affect us in Germany. We have seen these huge migratory flows. So I'm fairly proud to be able to see that in this arc of crisis from Syria, Lebanon, Libya, we are one of the great donors that is trying to stabilize this region. It's much better to see to it that people have a good life back home, that they do not give all their money to traffickers. And the best way to go about this is to help the people there on the ground in their own countries. So we work together with these countries, but we also work together with African countries. You know that during our G20 presidency, during our G7 presidency, we have tried to do a lot with the African partners. Africa is unfortunately always seen as a continent of problems. But if you look at the fact how Africa is working together multilaterally, such a huge continent with more than 2 billion people, they're strengthening their regional associations. They wish to introduce freedom of movement. They have clear ideas on future combined infrastructure projects. I think we ought to see them as a continent of hope, indeed, and of opportunity. We, the neighbors of Africa. For us, a clear commitment to multilateralism is essential, although obviously it needs courage. It is a precondition for shaping this world of tomorrow, and I think it's good to bring us together. Anything else will lead us into destruction, and we therefore think our future lies in the European Union, because we strongly believe that the European Union can muster the courage, can muster the strength to tackle these challenges. We all have to live with the shock that Britain wishes to leave the Union. All of my efforts go towards try to get that, see that this is happening in a well-ordered manner. We want to have a good future partnership as regards foreign policy, security policy, defense. We are absolutely dependent on good cooperation with Britain, but we're also a trade area. And the less complicated the easier our relations are, the better for all of us. We have in the European Union always been a champion for free trade. I am delighted that on the 1st of February we now will have the EU-Japan free trade agreement, and we also are for trade talks with the United States of America. We have been able to complete trade talks with Canada, and I think others should follow Singapore, Australia, if possible with Mercosur and with others. Ladies and gentlemen, in Europe, we have decided to make a very bold step forward. We want to coordinate in the future our possibilities to defend ourselves, to merge them. Thinking defense policy together is not something that is directed against NATO. Quite the contrary. It can even make it easier for NATO because we have more than 170 different weapon systems. The United States, I believe, have less than 60. So that you can well envisage what a sort of loss in efficiency this is in, for example, maintenance and repair. And with France together, we decide to build tanks of the future, aircraft, combat aircraft of the future. That's a very important strategic decision, such as the adoption of the Treaty of Aachen yesterday between France and Germany as a further development of the Élysée Treaty. We wanted to see this to be seen as a commitment to we as strong and important partners working for Europe, developing the European Union further. And for me, it was most moving to see that not only the French president and the German chancellor sign a treaty, but this was done in the presence of the president of the Commission, the president of the European Council, and of the rotating presidency, the president of Romania. In order to make it very clear, we want to give a strong contribution to strengthening Europe. We as Germans obviously always have our difficulties in the sense with multilateralism for trying to adopt directives on arms exports together with France, well, is a very difficult task for us. But we have to do this because no one will wish to develop weapon systems together with us if they are not absolutely certain that they can sell them to other parts of the world. So multilateralism is not all that easy for us too. But I always have to think of the possible alternative. What does this mean? We see this in all our countries. We have populist challenges. We have nationalist movements. We have to stand up against them. But maybe the battle lines are clearer drawn in this way. I will, together with my colleagues in Germany, in the cabinet, come out strongly in favor of a multilateral order not ending with the European Union, but to see to it that it is one that really gives good answers to the challenges of tomorrow, which means that the existing order cannot be ruined in such a way that no one believes in the validity of the international system anymore. Thank you very much for allowing me to present this to you.